Hello, Dr. Hélène Landemore. It's such a pleasure to host you on the Network Capital podcast. In this podcast, we try and understand why leaders in different fields, business women and men, academics, thinkers, politicians, do what they do. You've had a very interesting career spanning across countries and continents, and we are delighted to have a conversation about reimagining politics without politicians. You've done a bunch of work, but let's get started by understanding who you are and what do you do today.
Thank you, Utkarsh, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I am currently a professor of political science at Yale University. I'm a French native who moved to the US when I was 25 to start a PhD in political science. But before that, I studied philosophy in France and political science, actually. So I had a sort of dual interest at the time already. And I started my studies focused on the question of choice and human choice and how do we make the right decision as individuals and as groups. And it naturally evolved, I think, towards a study of democratic institutions, democratic values, the meaning of democracy. And I ended up writing first a book in French on the concept of probability in the work of David Hume, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, and then a book in English on the epistemic value of democracy, of rule by the many. And now, as you said, I'm about to publish a new book in English, Open Democracy, Reinventing Popular Rule for the 21st Century, where I try to imagine what democracy would look like if we reinvented it more or less from scratch with the sort of right vision and the right tools.
Thank you. How did you come to choose politics as a field of research?
That's a very good question because I never had an interest in politics growing up. I was interested in novels. I wanted to become a writer. I then was fascinated by philosophy, and politics seemed just a messy world of conflicting interests, conflicting egos, and I had no interest in it at all. But then when I came to the US, first of all, there was this big political awakening, you might say, that happened more or less when I landed. And I arrived a week before 9/11. And so, within a week, I had all these like geopolitical questions that I had to face in my personal life.
Wow, that's quite a week to enter the country.
So, yeah, that was a big awakening. But then somehow I again went back to more academic, more intellectual questions. I was not really following politics in the sort of quotidian sense where, it's about winning races and beating adversaries, etc. As a field, I think I was drawn to it because it's in the continuation of my interest in this question of choice. I think I reached the limits of what philosophy could bring me. And I felt like I needed social scientific tools to address the questions I kept running into. So there was something about, for example, rational choice theory that I thought was really intriguing, and the way that you could formalize human choices by positing some assumptions about self-interest, rationality, things like that. And so I think I think I'm driven by questions rather than a taste for a certain methodology. So I think it was a natural evolution towards political science as a field, but I'm not sure I'm going to stay in political science. In a way, I'm also drawn to psychology, to sociology, to ethnography, to all these other tools. And so I see myself more as a traveler across disciplines, and I just try to look at what's useful for me at a particular point of the inquiry, if you want.
Yeah, and before we dive deeper into some of the questions that you raised through your research, I want to understand what's the difference between, say, the culture at a Grand École or a Sciences Po where you studied, and say Harvard or Yale where you studied further and teach now. What's the fundamental cultural difference, if at all?
That's a very interesting question. So if you want me to reduce it to one, I would say, and it's not going to be flattering to the French system, but I felt like when I was in France, I never spoke. All I did was sit in the back of the class and take down notes and look up to these really impressive teachers that I was, brought up to respect and never question, and take on the wisdom of these past authors and similarly never really question it. Whereas when I came to Harvard, honestly, the biggest shock, the thing that blew me away and really attracted me to this system, it was the fact that you were the one supposed to come up with questions and even answers. And all these previous authors that you read were instrumental to your own questioning and the problems of your society and your times. And similarly, that was reflected this sort of openness to your own ideas. And the need to come out of your shell and talk and speak up in seminars, which I wasn't used to, and took a long time for me to get used to. It was reflected in the attitude of professors. So in France, I would just never bother professors. I would never go to the office hours. I would rarely ask a question. And you felt like if you asked a question, it had to be a really good one that displayed your erudition and didn't really threaten the authority and wisdom of what had been said. Whereas when I walked into professors' offices at Harvard, it was, what can I do for you? They just were there for you, to listen to you, to help you figure out your own path. They respected your questions. They never talked you down. That was the main difference for me.
Thank you. You've been very interested in questions about why should you do the right thing.
Yes.
Let's blow it up and understand, why should groups do the right thing? What's the intrinsic motivator?
Ooh, okay. Well, that's a very deep question. I don't know that I've solved that one. So they should do the right thing because ultimately it's better for them as groups, and it's better for the individuals in the group. And so, but the problem is, like, it's not always. There might be a difference between what's good for individuals and what's good for the group. The big question is, how do you reconcile those two things?
Yeah.
And then there's a question of the group might do the right thing for its people, but this might require doing the wrong thing for people outside the group, right? So I think you've got a multivariable problem here that I think social sciences are precisely about trying to solve. Otherwise, from a philosophical perspective, you might say, well, groups like individuals need to do the right thing because there are intrinsic rewards to doing the right thing. You get back to these philosophical answers, but I think it's very important to look at these questions through the social scientific angle that shows you all the tensions and irrationalities that can arise from the clash between incentives at the group and at the individual level, or between groups.
Understood. Would it be fair to say that democracy globally is in a state of crisis today?
Yes, I think it's in a state of crisis. I think we are reaching the limits of a model of democracy we invented in the 18th century, which turned out to be not so democratic. And because it's not so democratic, it deprives itself of the resources of what I call, and many people call, collective wisdom, or what I call democratic reason, in the sense that these models of democracy we use and reproduce exclude too many people from the center of power, such that their voices are not heard, their perspectives are not taken into account, and their insights and information and wisdom are not factored in the decision-making process. And I think we are in part in a crisis because of that. So I like, a lot of questions, I think this question has multiple answers, and it's not like that's the only problem. Even if you fix the democracies we live in along the lines that I suggest in my book, Open Democracy, by reintroducing the wisdom of ordinary citizen at the center of power and designing institutions better, you would still face all these problems that are brought about, say, globalization or technologies or these other, phenomena that we also have to face. And so globalization creates problems for democracies because they put them in competition with each other, or in competition with other regime forms like more authoritarian regimes like China or Singapore. And so we are basically facing a wicked problem of multiple sources of the crisis of democracy. And my work really only addresses one, which is the failure of institutions to track the collective wisdom of the people of a given country. And I think it would be great to fix that. That would solve some of the problems, but it wouldn't solve them all.
Is there a crisis between, say, the inclusiveness of the democratic process and the kind of outcomes it offers? Somebody once said that populism is what you call democracy when you don't like the outcome. And I think this sort of touches upon the work that you've done around inclusiveness and what the result is. Do you want to comment on this quote, or just provide color into where you were coming from or where you developed this?
Right. The quote, you mean populism is what you call democracy when you don't like it, or is that what you just said?
Both. Like inclusiveness and outcomes of democracy, are they at odds today? And is populism a direct result of it?
Oh, I see. Well, the problem is that it's the conditions under which you practice inclusiveness, right? And if you practice inclusiveness in a way that's not sufficiently deliberative, then you will bring in not so much the what I call democratic reason or collective wisdom as sort of mob thought or the folly of crowds, right? So you've got to be very careful about the conditions under which you practice democratic inclusiveness. And I think it's part of the reflections in my book is to say, look, you need to create a system that's open and inclusive in a deliberative manner, so that you get people to process their own preferences and thoughts in a way that will naturally filter out the irrationality, the incoherence, the anger, potentially the racism, and so that you end up with the best of what democracy can produce. That said, I do think that it's a little too easy to say that any form of direct democracy or openness to people's will is populism. And I think that I would accept that sort of criticism because in some cases it seems justified, but only if we practice the same skepticism or worry toward elitism. But elitism, which is the polar opposite of populism and is constantly in tension with it, is rarely criticized to the same degree. And so I feel like populism currently is a colleague of mine, John McCormick, would say, a cry of pain, and we need to take it seriously. And I think we've swung the pendulum too much towards experts and elected officials and elected elites for many years. People who are supposed to have the superior wisdom, the superior knowledge of the solutions. And this populism moment is a time when the pendulum swings back. And if it swings back too quickly and without reflection about the best conditions to include people, then it might veer toward dangerous forms of populism. But I think the move towards more inclusion is good. And we just need to think carefully about how can we open the doors of power, of places where decisions are, important decisions are made to more people without that, drifting into the tyranny of the vocal minority or the tyranny of the racist majority, actually. So it needs to be carefully. Yeah.
Tell us, do voters select representatives or representatives select voters?
Well, it's probably a little bit of both. You're talking about classic electoral representation, right? So where democracy is equated with the rule of elected elites with the consent of the people, which I see less and less as a form of democracy. To be honest, I I think I've come to accept the conclusion that an author like Bernard Manin reached, in 1995 in a very good book that I recommend to your audience, The Principles of Representative Government. And he said that, we know from ancient authors that election was always seen as an oligarchic selection mechanism for rulers, and that the true democratic selection mechanism is actually random selection, so selection by lot. So we try to democratize the system to make it appear as a system where, citizens rule vicariously and they've got a form of democratic power because they get to choose their political leaders. And yet it's true that this question of choice, is problematic. I mean, we see now that money can buy you votes, money can influence the way candidates are perceived, and so you can manipulate voters who are cognitive misers and have little time on their hands to read through all the political proposals or learn about candidates. You can get them to vote for whomever you want, and so there's a real question of who's choosing who. I fear that in the US particularly, where money plays such a role, the choice is actually much more restricted than we think. Then again, when you look at the results of Super Tuesday, for example, you see that even somebody as rich and influential as Mike Bloomberg wasn't able to buy the elections after all. So there might still be enough choice in the current system that completely corrupted. But what I'm talking about is not just returning the possibility of real choice to the voters. It's really more about changing the way we look at democracy and opening the door of power. So basically, the door of Congress, of Parliament, to ordinary citizens, so that they don't get to rule vicariously through people they choose, and really only choose among the list that's offered to them, right? But open the doors of power to them in a much more meaningful way.
Yeah, in 2016, for example, as you've written, it was an election between, in the US, two extremely unpopular candidates. And a lot of the people who did not vote somehow found themselves lacking of motivation. We see that such trends are happening more and more. So is this fatigue? Is this lethargy? Or is it just helplessness on behalf of citizens not participating in the electoral process?
See, this accusation of lethargy and apathy and carelessness, it's typically an elitist move. I mean, this is what you see in Seymour Lipset in the 30s. It's really when in fact the apathy and carelessness is endogenous to the system we have, meaning it's produced by the institution, the electoral institutions we have. I actually understand why people don't bother voting. It's not appealing. You get to vote between people that you don't really care about one way or another. So again, that's the sort of wisdom that Bernard Manin had already in 1995. He was saying, look, elections are a Janus-faced mechanism, meaning it has two faces, right? One is democratic because it's true. We have one vote. We operate on the basis of the democratic basis of one person, one vote. But when it comes to candidates, they're not treated equally, meaning we don't have all of us an equal chance of being elected, right? So power is distributed unequally amongst all of us when we distribute power through elections. And in fact, people who have a chance of winning elections are exceptional people, extraordinary people, sometimes for bad reasons, because they have certain properties and let's say charisma or money or social visibility that are unevenly distributed in the population. So I think the problem is not with individual voters. I don't think the problem is with their apathy or their irrationality or their carelessness. Surely there are people who are apathetic and careless, but I don't think it's the vast majority of people. It's with the incentives set up by this electoral system And the thing is that for a long time, like a lot of people, I thought, well, let's just fix this system. Let's just fix the incentives in this system, right? If we take money out of politics, if we create social and economic conditions where even a nurse can find the time to run for elections and have a real chance of being elected. Well, actually, I no longer think this can be fixed in an empirical way, meaning that even if you assume ideal conditions, elections will still suffer from this problem of biasing the output towards the social and economic elite, or any kind of elite in the population, meaning any kind of subgroup that has properties that are unevenly distributed in the population. And that, in the end, is a real problem because it's contrary to the meaning of democracy. The meaning of democracy is a system in which people are treated equally and inclusively, and that's not what we get in our current system.
Very well said, Dr. Landemore. It seems like the representative democracy is not really representative. What is open democracy? Could you tell our listeners how you came up with this term? And is there a way to present a better alternative than we have today, a more inclusive outcome, so to speak?
Yes, so open democracy, it's a system in which the center of power is kept as wide open as possible to the ordinary citizen, while not turning into direct democracy, where all people at all times would have to decide on everything. So how do you do that? You do that through essentially the resort to random selection, or you might say, if it's more easy to visualize, civic lotteries. Basically, all of us, let's say at birth, we're endowed with a unique number, and regularly when we hit 18, it's a legal majority, we get entered into civic lotteries that assign us to various political roles throughout our lives. And in particular, they will assign us at some point to a legislature that who's tasked to set the agenda for perhaps another randomly selected body, or perhaps an elected assembly if we keep those. But basically, where the first word is to the people. And in fact, my ideal of open democracy is that you get randomly selected citizens, ordinary citizens, to constantly circulate in and out of power, to refresh the ideas, the pool of ideas, to constantly maintain the lack of corruption and the honesty of thoughts and intentions, so that you don't get an enclosure of power in a sort of separate, professionalized elite. So that's the idea. And I get the concept of open democracy. Well, I suppose it came relatively easily. I did feel like the main characteristics of modern governments were their closedness, the fact that power seemed only accessible to certain people with certain looks, accents, connections, wealth, charisma, etc. And I always felt like, well, not everyone can enter those buildings, like those parliaments. They're guarded, they're intimidating, they're just not open. And so by contrast, the sort of ideal seemed to be something that would be open and sort of kept the world. And it dovetailed neatly with the ideals of the open democracy, the open society that you have in Karl Popper, so a sort of liberal ideal of a society that's open to ideas and non-authoritarian, non-hierarchical. So I just politicize that more, if you want. Instead of talking about a society that's open, I wanted to talk about a political system that's actually open.
Yeah, it also rings a bell of open source and other things, although I'm
absolutely.
not sure if you...
So that's absolutely true. So in open source, the idea is that anybody can modify the code, right? and change it and improve it for the common good. And ideally, that's also what you'd want in a democracy. Like any one of us who has an idea about how to fix the law, to fix the rules, should be able to chip in and be part of the process, right? So that's connected. And I do think that also technologies may help us increase the roles of citizens, because one of the big challenges is the scale, right? When you have societies that count millions of citizens, how do you include them all in an organized way, in a way that is not utter chaos and doesn't let the most vocal or the most the people with the most intense preference take over, and so that's a challenge, and maybe technologies can help there.
Yeah, we're going to discuss that in just a bit. But it seems like there is a way to combine deliberation and the wisdom of crowds. And you talk about some practical examples like Finland, Iceland, even France. Do you think it's a model that can be applied to other countries as well, potentially more diverse countries like, say, India or the US or the UK?
Yes, so I always thought it was applicable, because most of the so-called democratic innovations of these experiments I looked at in small countries like Finland and Iceland are scalable. So one point I need to make, because I realize I've been talking as if it's obvious, but maybe it's not, is that the reason why I'm not in favor of direct democracy, a democracy of permanent referenda, like some people favor, is because of deliberation. I think you need this phase of thoughtful engagement with other people's points of views, preferably in a very diverse setting where you really encounter a diversity of points of view. So you need a moment of representation. And I think the one of the provocations of the book is to say, look, we associate representation and elections since the 18th century. We've been doing that sort of unconsciously since the 18th century. But it's just a contingent fact of history that we chose elections in the 18th century when we could have chosen lotteries to choose our representatives, right? So I'm just saying, look, we could just start, maybe not from scratch entirely, but we could just imagine a different version of representative democracy, which is based on sortition, so random selection or civic lotteries, rather than elections. And it would be a lot truer to the meaning of popular rule, so ruled by the people, treated in equal and inclusive manner. So that's an important thing to say, because my model retains representative features, even as I reject the historical paradigm of representative democracy, because by that we tend to mean electoral democracy. So that's why I prefer to use a different term to refer to my own model, open democracy. But it retains a core of representation, except it's done through the means of random selection or civic lotteries rather than elections. So I'm sorry, I forgot your question, but
No, I mean, this is exactly what I was asking. I mean, I was just trying to get to the practical aspects of it.
Oh, the practical aspect, yes, Iceland and Finland, correct. So yes, so those ideas that I got about open democracy, they came from the observation of empirical practices. I mean, when I finished my last book, I still had a relatively conservative understanding of democracy. Actually, I had landed in a place where I thought sortition was essential, but I thought, well, we can just have ruled by like a randomly selected body, and I just didn't necessarily see the need to connect that body to the larger public. And then when I did this experiment in Finland, it was an exercise in crowdsourcing, where the government wanted to crowdsource, so outsource to a crowd, the ideas for a reform of the regulation, for the reform of snowmobile regulation, basically. Because what happened in Finland is that there was an exponential rise in the number of snowmobiles in the northern part of Finland, and they caused all kinds of problems with reindeer, herds, with trees being damaged, etc. But then the snowmobile industry didn't want any interference. The lobbies prevented the elected legislators to make any change. So they thought, okay, let's try something completely new. Let's try to involve the public. And when I read through the comments that came to our platform, I was really impressed. I thought, well, actually, the public has enormous potential to help find the best solutions. And I thought, well, then that must mean that even if we have a randomly selected body at the heart of the legislative system, it cannot be closed. It cannot be limited to the 100 people that are selected. It needs to be constantly open and nourished in its thinking by the input of the people outside of it, the people who are interested and can join voluntarily the deliberative platform.
And I think one thing that really, sorry.
No, I was going to say, and then the worry then was that, well, because we got like a few thousand comments at most, and that's still manageable, and yet it's still a lot of work, right? So the worry is that, oh, what if you did that in a much larger country and you got millions of comments? Who's going to read all of it? So that could seem a worry, but in fact, thanks to technologies, I think we could sort of synthesize that relatively quickly and well enough to so that it's usable and digestible by the legislators. And so in Iceland, same thing. I mean, the design that they used in 2011 to rewrite their constitution is completely scalable. It started with a group of 950 randomly selected citizens who, over a day, came together and listed the values and principles they wanted to see in their constitution. So, for example, among them was the idea of a right. Sorry, that's later. The idea of collectivization of the natural resources that were not already privately owned, and a set of ambitions and values that made complete sense given the culture there, and they were transferred to a group of 25 elected citizens, but they were not professional politicians. They were elected from a pool that excluded professional politicians. So those 25 were a lot more diverse in their skill set and profession than people in parliament. And those 25, on the basis of what the 950 randomly selected that said, wrote a text that then was put to a referendum that passed by 2/3 of the votes, and then this decision, the text was not turned into law. But the point is that the text they produced was of high quality. I spent some time reading it, assessing it in comparative manner with expert drafts written at the same time, and I guarantee you it's an excellent text. You can read it online. It's translated in English. And all of the steps of that very interesting process are scalable. You can have a randomly selected sample of agenda setters, if you will, in any country of any size. You can have an elected assembly of people writing the draft in any country, obviously, although my preference might be for an actually randomly selected body, and perhaps a larger one. And then the crowdsourcing phase, so the fact that this body of 25 put online their successive drafts for the whole country to chip in and give their opinion about various articles and formulations is also scalable. So, and of course, the referenda at the end we do regularly in many countries. So, to me, I always thought that these processes were scalable. The problem is that objectors always pointed out the fact that these examples took place in very small countries and very homogeneous countries. So Iceland is really the size of a large city. It's 230,000. Sorry, it's 320,000 people. And then Finland is, I think, a few million people. And then Ireland, the most successful to date, I didn't study it myself, but it's a very important example of a prototype of open democracy, at least in one aspect. They passed sort of constitutional reforms allowing gay marriage and abortion, respectively, in 2014 and 2018, on the basis of the proposals by randomly selected assemblies of 100 people each. And so that's considered, in my world, an enormous success for the idea that these kind of randomly selected bodies can produce good laws or form the basis for proposals that then are turned into law through referenda or other means. But the problem is, like, there again, in one of the most successful cases, we were dealing with a very small country, 5 million people, and a very homogeneous one, very white, very Christian. So every time I run into that obstacle. But then, luckily for me, last year, what happened is that my own country of France, got into a crisis.
The Gilets jaunes.
You probably heard of them. Yes, the Gilets
jaunes, yeah.
Yellow vests. Went on the street, demonstrated for months, broke things on the Champs-Élysées. Basically, it really threatened power in a big way. And President Macron decided to answer this crisis in what I think was the only reasonable way, which was through a deliberative, wide-scale consultation that we call the Great National Debate. Because, as you know, everything is great in France, so it had to be a national debate. And it lasted about 2 months. It stopped everything. People talked about it a lot. There were many ways to enter that debate. You could go online and put your suggestion on a platform. The platform was terrible, actually, so that's probably the least interesting aspect. But it gathered 2 million submissions, right? So it's quite impressive. You could also join one of the 10,000 local meetings that happen all around the country. And if you were lucky, you were also drawn into 21 randomly selected assemblies that took place at the regional level. So, multiple methods were used to include people in relatively new ways. And what's exciting, in particular with this set of 21 regional assemblies, because they drew in people who had never participated in politics whatsoever. So you got a new sample of people interested, motivated, and you can tell in those contexts, these people are not apathetic, not uninterested, not passive. On the contrary, you cannot imagine the amount of goodwill and effort and passion people brought to the assembly. So on the basis of that, Macron then decided to create this past fall, in October, a nationwide citizens assembly. So we call it the Citizens Convention on climate change. So on the issue of climate change. And after spending already close to I think 12 million euros on the Great National Debate, they decided to spend almost 5 million euros on this new, nationwide random sample of 150 French citizens. And they've been meeting since October for 6 times now. So the next weekend is the 6th time. And there will be a 7th meeting in March, where they're going to deliver the recommendations to the French president about how to reduce France's carbon emissions or green gas emissions by 40% of the 1990s levels, and the whole thing in the spirit of social justice. So it's an enormous task that was asked of them to perform. They've been advised by experts. They've been supported by an incredible staff of facilitators, and it's a big unknown. Will it work? But as far as I'm concerned, it has already worked. I mean, the way the deliberations have been conducted has been very successful. I think they're heading for some really interesting proposals, and you can see that this worked in a country that counts 67 million citizens and is the most multicultural in Europe. So I told you this very long story just to conclude that, from my perspective, the objection that certain aspects of my ideal of open democracy could only work in small, homogeneous countries has been falsified. It can be done it can be done in a lot more countries. So of course you might say, well, okay, but India, it's other ballpark altogether. Like it's an enormous country, multiple languages, multiple religions. And indeed, that's the next challenge. But based on other forms of empirical evidence about the feasibility of large-scale deliberation among multilingual groups, I'm also convinced. It's just a matter of setting the incentives right, investing enough time and money into the infrastructure, and I'm sure this can be done. In fact, I'm always shocked by, we're completely desensitized to the amount of money that's going into electoral politics. So Mike Bloomberg, to go back to him, spent 500 million just on his a couple of weeks. I mean, how long was he in campaign anyway? And
yeah, hundreds of millions a week.
While people are horrified because we spent 12 million euros on the Great National Debate and 5 million euros on this convention on climate change, I think it's peanuts money. I think we should really start investing a lot more in authentically inclusive and democratic designs, because it will pay off. It's worth it. And so I'm always shocked that we're willing to pour money into advertisement, into lobbies, consulting, and all kinds of things that are not that productive from a democratic point of view, and yet be stingy on institutions that could involve regular citizens in a good and productive way. For example, the Irish citizen assemblies didn't pay their participants. Well, at least we made some progress. And in fact, the 21 regional assemblies of the French national debate also didn't pay their participants. But if you don't pay participants, then you deprive yourself of the wisdom of people who can't afford to come, So you just need to start taking people's time seriously and compensate. And that's what the government in France did for this convention on climate change. And it's not that much money. I think they could probably be paid more, but they paid them the sort of honorarium you get when you participate in a criminal jury. So it's about 80 euros a day or something like that.
Yeah, it's at least some incentive for people to actually think of it as work. I mean, this is, thank you so much for sharing. It's fascinating to hear what's happening in France. Do you think that when it comes to technical issues like artificial intelligence, climate change, a randomly selected sample is going to be technically equipped to handle the challenges? You did mention that it doesn't mean that experts are out, but they can consult. So, you believe that a randomly selected sample who consults with an expert will perhaps produce an equally good result, perhaps a better result than, say, a set of experts. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's what I believe in the end. I think, you can have two models. Either you put experts at the center and they regularly consult the people.
Right.
Or you do the opposite. And I'm really convinced now that the opposite model is probably better, in part because and maybe I'm wrong, and this is really something where I think we need to run more experiments, basically, to conclude something a bit more solid than based on pure speculations. But I still think that in terms of agenda setting, we should have a random sample, because it's about values and preferences, and those are typically not technical. But actually, even on technical issues, and this is not something I was actually I anticipated that much. I thought the climate change was probably too technical myself. But then when I've seen these citizens in action, what I see as their main contribution is that they constantly reopen the boxes that are closed and locked by experts. So experts have great ideas, but they tend to think within frameworks and using concepts and models that are kind of fixed. And what I've seen the citizens do when they listen to them and they ask questions is constantly force them to reopen their assumptions, question their methods, and in fact their naivete plays in favor of the collective wisdom of the group, because so the ideal, in fact, is to combine the input of the experts and the input of the citizens in the best possible way. And I think the the system in which the experts are at the center and the citizens are sometimes consulted, but in a very superficial way and sort of a superficial way, not very deep, not very serious, and with the assumption that in the end the expert knows best, has proven its limits already. We know that it doesn't work that well. So let's try something different. I think these citizens' assemblies have proven themselves already on very technical issues like electoral reform in British Columbia in 2004. They've proven themselves on perhaps slightly less technical issues, but very difficult issues like abortion and gay marriage in Ireland. They've proven themselves, well, actually, that's true in Iceland because the people who drafted the constitution were actually elected. But my own conviction is that they could have done a decent job if they had been randomly selected as well. So again, I'm not sure what basically, I don't have a clear idea what the perfect model is. It could be a hybrid assembly. So for example, in Ireland, something I forgot to mention, the first assembly was actually two-thirds randomly selected citizens, one-third elected officials. And it worked out quite well. So I'm only dealing in models. I'm a political theorist, I'm a political philosopher. So I'm only looking at this in part first through a deductive model, right? And then I nurture it and I complement it with empirical observations. But it could be that what's really needed is something that we will only figure out through trial and error, like a hybrid system. It's very hard to sort of model and to anticipate its merits from a philosophical perspective.
No, absolutely. I think there's no reason not to try. And I think what further strengthens your hypothesis is that if you look at campaigns, the skills that are required to get elected are very different from the skills that are required to actually run the government. Yeah. And I think a lot of the politicians have to, learn from the basics, learn quickly. And many times they lack the kind of cognitive diversity that, say, a wisdom of crowd or a randomly collected sample can have. So I think that definitely this model surely seems like one that should be tried.
I should add, if I may, when I said experts at the center, actually I was thinking of actual scientific experts, but it's true that we tend to call experts elected officials. And my conviction is that they're not really experts. I mean, the reality is that bills are written by, they're outsourcing the writing of bills and laws to lobbyists, to actual experts, to
consulting firms, to firms they want to give business to.
And so it's not clear that what are they doing? They're spending their time campaigning for re-election. They are posturing in large assemblies. They're posturing on TV to gain our votes. I guess I'm not completely entirely disillusioned with them. I think there's probably still a role even in my model for them, and I think their ambition and devotion and the talent of many of them is certainly to be recognized. But I just think that theoretically, at least I find more promise in the civic lottery and the randomly selected assemblies, at least for the moment.
In fact, you even offer a lot of historical context for something like this, like in the form of what you call lotocracy or mini publics. How was it back in the day? And is there something that in the historical past we can look at for inspiration?
Yeah, so first of all, the term lotocracy is not mine. I borrowed it from Alex Guerrero, who is a philosopher at the University of Rutgers, who's also very much a proponent of a randomly based system. We're a whole cohort of theorists who believe in this now. So, and I should say that yes, of course, there's a precedent for these ideas that is to be found in classical Athens. So the ancient Greeks had a model which is much closer to what I mean by open democracy, even though it had all these extreme flaws of excluding, women and slaves and metics and foreigners. But if you looked at the people who counted as citizens, the logic of the distribution of power there was extremely democratic. because it didn't rely on elections. The Greeks didn't have elections. They only used elections for the choice of generals and some administrators. But when it came to positions of power that had to do with making the law, it was all based on either random selection, so civic lotteries, or open assemblies that anybody could join, right?
Yeah.
So of course, and it worked. So the big question is, okay, but maybe it worked because it was so small. There were 30,000 citizens in Athens, really, and it was very ethnically homogeneous. So the same kind of objections that are pointed out when I bring up the case of Iceland or Finland or Ireland. I actually don't think that's a good objection, because even 30,000 people, it's still too many people for them to make decisions all together at once. So when we talk about this model as a model of direct democracy, it's not entirely true. I think they did have representative mechanisms. For example, this Council of 500 that set the agenda for the Open Assembly, it was based on a delegation of power to a subset, right? The people rotating in and out of power. It wasn't all of them at once, because you needed some kind of deliberative exchanges among themselves to come up with an agenda. And then among the 30,000 citizens, only 6,000 ever showed up to the Open Assembly. So it was a subset of them. I tend to see that as a form of what I call self-selected representation, where the selection mechanism is just your desire to join, basically. But the meeting place was not big enough. The clique, they called it at the time, was not big enough to allow all 30,000 of them to meet. So there was a selection process to limit the number of people actually making the decision in that assembly.
Understood. In your forthcoming book, Open Democracy, you talk about the 5 requirements for it. So one is equal and universal participatory rights, deliberation as part of the process, majority rule, democratic representation, and transparency. I understand all of them, but could you provide more color into majority rule, and what do you mean by that?
Yes, majority rule actually is I think it's really important, and I think that if you look at the institutions we've evolved since the 18th century, they're surprisingly counter-majoritarian. So we've evolved institutions that are bicameral, for example, supposedly because it's meant to slow down the process and make room for greater deliberation. At least in the US, I'm not sure that's what we got. I think you get gridlock and statu quo bias, which always tend to favor the interests of a minority. So you end up with a system which is characterized by minority rule as opposed to majority rule. And why is that? I'm not going to speculate whether it was by design or by accident, but the fact is that there was a great fear in the 18th and 19th century of the so-called tyranny of the majority. And here my fellow French theorist, Alexis de Tocqueville, did a lot of damage, because he coined that phrase, the tyranny of the majority. And when he diagnosed something real, I think in the end you have to consider that you're either facing tyranny of the majority or tyranny of the minority. And so both are equally bad. And so you create institutions that are meant to curb it, to curb any form of tyranny, whether by the minority or the majority. But that doesn't mean you want to eliminate the possibility for a majority to have its way when it comes to decisions that are constitutional and perfectly legal and are not violating anybody's rights. So I think we have to accept the fact that democracy also means majority rule, and sometimes we won't like it. So whether you take in particular, let's say you take Brexit, the Brexit decision. Well, I think at that point it's pretty clear that that's what the British people really wanted. So for a long time I thought, well, maybe if they had a deliberative, randomly selected assembly to think through those issues, and they would have concluded, something close to what I think was the right answer. But it turns out that I think now that the recent elections show, I think that this was not a fluke, this was not a mistake, this was something that they really wanted. So learning to accept decisions by the majority is also really an important part of the model, because I think the alternative is ruled by the minority, and it's also an alternative to what I see as a wrong interpretation of the deliberative democracy ideal. So in the 90s, when this ideal started being theorized, including by people like Jürgen Habermas, Josh Cohen, John Dryzek, Besset, lots of people. I think we confused deliberation and consensus. We had this idea that we're seeking to get everybody on board, which is a good thing, but it must mean the decision needs to be taken by consensus. And the problem with when you define the end of your deliberation as consensus, it creates a pressure to conform among members of the group. And I think that's really counterproductive, because you want to preserve dissent. You want to preserve people who, the freedom of people to disagree. So I'm much more in favor of something I call positive dissensus. With my co-author Scott Page, we came up with the phrase where sometimes it's just better to end the deliberation with a positive dissensus, where we agree to disagree, and then take a vote where everybody chooses, in their own conscience about what they deem to be the best option, and then you just accept the majority verdict. So that's why I thought it was very important to have that in the list of principles, just after deliberation, actually.
This is very helpful context. Open democracy, open source. Very briefly, could you touch upon how has technology, or how will technology augment open democracy, or take it in the other direction?
Or threaten it, you mean?
Yeah.
So I think technologies. I'm a congenital optimist, so I'm not as scared by.
It's a good thing to be.
Yes, well, I can't help it anyway, so that's what I contribute to the conversation, I guess. I'm not as scared by technology as some people are. I don't know. I'm not a specialist, so this is going to sound very, non-technical. But I have this Google device at home, and I'm really shocked by how, unhelpful and stupid and not impressive at all it is. It can't translate anything. It doesn't know anything about French pop from the 80s. It still hasn't adjusted to the various accents in my household. I mean,
which is what Serbian, French, and English, right?
Yes, exactly.
Quite a multinational household.
Yes, and you think, oh my God, if there's AI in there, it should really learn. It's learning nothing as far as I can tell. So same thing for self-driving cars. I anticipate that, except on a very sunny, beautiful highway in California, it's not going to work anywhere. I can't anticipate how it would work. I can't imagine how it would work here with all the snow we have, for example, on the East Coast. So I just don't know. I feel like we're far away from an actual real threat. Even when it comes to what happened during the elections and in the US or in the UK, I still haven't seen an actually convincing empirical demonstration that these, targeting tools, ads and stuff like that actually caused the result. I think that Trump could have won without them. I think that Brexit probably would have happened without them. I'm not as scared, let's put it that way for now. And in terms of the help they can provide, sadly, but it's a flip side of that, is that I think they're useful, but they could be a lot more useful than they currently are. So when I look at what the French did, for example, in the Great National Debate. So as I said, we got a ton of input from the population in the Great National Debate. 2 million contributions on the online platform. 100,000 pages of PDF, were digitized by the National Public Library from the local meetings and local grievance books that people wrote. And how are you going to deal with all that massive information? So the government paid private companies to digest all of that and give summaries and do data analysis basically. But what did they use? They used knowledge trees, which are methods that were invented more or less in the 60s, and classic statistical analysis methods that I think are quite old. So not like AI helped in any way. And then so one thing that I've heard of that could be promising is that I'm told Jim Fishkin at the Center for Deliberative Democracy he has at Stanford has developed an algorithm called Alice that's supposed to help facilitate large meetings. So okay, if that works, I'd love to see it. I'd love to try it. Because there's a problem of cost, in my proposals, although I said that we should invest more money into democratic institutions, but it's costly to have human facilitators at tables of 6-7 people for large scale meetings, especially if you do many of them. So if we could automate that, why not? That would be very useful. But so far, I don't see the threat nor the promise so much, sadly.
No, this is super helpful. I mean, in a way, Network Capital, our community, is trying to democratize career intelligence to open source career intelligence. So we totally resonate with many of your thoughts. My last set of questions, if you have time, is focused on open democracy and what it can teach the modern workplace. Do you think some of the principles that you espouse are applicable to, say, corporates and startups and just generally a workplace by making it more democratic and actually making it more democratic, not just setting up a V team that keeps having virtual meetings?
Yes, I think it's absolutely applicable. It's something that I hope to look more into in the future. But I think, these large corporations are in many ways political organizations. So it's something that also my co-author Isabel Ferreras has been arguing for. And I think more and more people are acknowledging that there are issues of power distribution, justice, equity, fairness in the workplace, basic freedom and non-domination. I mean, all these concepts that we study on a daily basis in political theory, by applying them to narrowly defined political settings, actually can travel to the economic setting of corporations and workplaces. And so, for example, you could imagine reinventing the governance structure of firms along the lines of an open democracy, right? So you could, so for example, my friend Isabel Ferraz, again, she envisages a classic bicameral system where you'd have a chamber for labor and a chamber for capital, but both would be elected, so she's thinking on the classical model of the democracies we know. And I'm thinking, why not then just randomly assign workers to at least one of those chambers so that you get a greater diversity? Because otherwise, what's going to happen? The classic hierarchies and inequities will be reproduced. These chambers will be peopled mostly by men, mostly by white people. And so it will be better in some ways, but it will still leave out the minorities and all the silent majorities that are classically ignored in the electoral system. So shy people, women, people of color, people with no charisma, those people have needs and interests and insights too. And I'm advocating for governance systems that recognize those people as well, that basically diffuse and distribute power equally.
Now, this is such a fascinating insight. This conversation has left us with so many mental models and questions that we as a group want to discuss and come back to you with during a masterclass. But thank you very much. This podcast goes out to 100,000 subscribers all around the world: France, US, China, India, what have you. And we look forward to keeping in touch and hosting you again very soon. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Utkarsh. Yeah, see you soon.